Hi, my name is Jeremy. I'm sitting here in the Guildhall Museum using our collection to reach out to you until the time you can come and visit us again. Now, I've made quite a few of these videos, but I'm going to make a few changes. This time, instead of picking a particular time in history, I'm going to pick a place. I've already made a video about Rochester. Today, we're going to go across the river to Strood. But I've got the same rules. I'm going to find 3 or 4 objects in the collection that tell you some of the things I think are most important about Strood. There's no question of what my first object is going to be. You see, Strood, just like the whole of the Medway area, just like the whole of North Kent, it's always been a place that people have needed to get through as much as they've wanted to go to. And that's just a fact of our geography. You see, the place where we live, its story really is all about a road and a river and the relationship between the two. Because we live in an area that's right on top of the way into Britain, or if you go the other way, the way out of Britain. And people have been going backwards and forwards in those directions for many thousands of years. So I'm really pleased that my first object is something to do with the road. And this was made in the 1700s. Roads were different. When we travel around in our cars today, we might look outside at the view, but the last thing we think about, usually, is the road under our wheels. Now, back in the 1700s, you would certainly be thinking about it, because roads, most of them, were really, really poor. They were so bad that often, at certain times of the year, they were completely impassable. They were muddy, deep mud. They were full of holes. You could hardly take a vehicle along them. So when the first modern roads started to appear, they were very special and very expensive to make. So what used to happen is you'd have to pay to use each stretch of new road. And to make sure you couldn't sneak past without paying, the start of the road always had a gate. And you had to stop at the gate and pay. And these gates were called turnpikes, and the roads were called turnpike roads. So this thing we got here is a poster from the Strood Turnpike. And it tells you how much you have to pay if you want to use the road. It's from 1792. Different people have to pay different amounts. So if you come along in a really big carriage, something that's pulled by 6 horses, so that's kind of like if you turn up in a Bentley or something, you have to pay a shilling. That's at the top of the list. At the bottom of the list, if you come along and you're in a cart just with 1 horse, you just have to pay 2p. And at the bottom, there's a list of people who don't have to pay at all. And they include soldiers and sailors who might be travelling to their regiment or to their ship. They include people moving prisoners around. They include people taking water between Rochester and Strood. Water is so important that you get to use the road for free. And they include people who are working for elections. It's really lucky survival, this thing. Because, of course, as the road spread and more of them were made, the gates themselves, they just got in the way because they stopped the traffic. So all the gates were knocked down and the bits of paper were just screwed up and thrown away. So not many of them survive. Now, my next object is all about a shop. Because if you've got a road going through a town, they often have shops on. People pass, people stop, people spend money. And one of the most famous Strood businesses was Sweets, the print shop. Now, if you're doing your homework and you want a picture to illustrate it or just to make it look fancy, you can search on the internet through thousands and thousands of images. Now in Sweets the printer, when they needed a picture, they went out the back to a big box of wood blocks. These things. And on the wood blocks was just about every kind of picture you could possibly think of. So there was bound to be one there to make a poster or a book look more attractive. They were old even when Sweets the printer bought them, and they kept them throughout the Victorian period until when the museum opened at the beginning of the 20th century, they gave them to the Rochester Museum. What I like about them is these are the kind of things that were used to illustrate the first children's books, because they were lying around, because they were cheap. And a lot of these pictures look like animal stories, which I think would have been perfect for children's books. This one, when you print it up, looks like this. Seems to be a story about a lion and a cockerel. Now, I know there's a traditional story about a fox and a cockerel, so maybe it's the same thing. This has been made out of one of these. You put ink over the top and print it. But some of the pictures are definitely not for children. This one, for instance, which makes this picture. Now this is from a sheet that would have been sold at a public execution. So these are people who have been convicted of a crime, who would be killed while loads of people were watching. And people would walk through the crowd and they would sell you a sheet with a poem on it or the story of this person and the crime that they committed. And they were usually illustrated with a picture like this. Now, another really famous Strood business was Aveling and Porter. This is all about Thomas Aveling. You might know his name because of the school that still exists in Medway that bears his name. Thomas was born in Cambridgeshire, a long way away, but he came to live in Hoo. But he built a factory in Strood. He was a really important inventor and engineer. When he was a young man, he got a job on a farm. And that was a time, this is the 1800s, when people were starting to use machines and engines to do work on the farm. Steam engines. But these first steam engines, they were really awkward to use because they were incredibly heavy but would only move if you attached a horse to it and dragged it to where you wanted it to go. So they used to use them for ploughing. The steam engine would drag the plough across the field, but then to do the next line of ploughing, the horses would have to be attached and they would drag the steam engine from place to place. It took ages. So Thomas Aveling looked at this and he thought, wouldn't it be brilliant if the steam engine could use its own power to move itself? So what he did is he linked up the engine with a set of wheels so that when the steam engine needed to move, it could be driven. Now, this was a huge success, and in Strood, he built the largest traction engine factory that the world had ever seen or will ever see. And he used to test them by running them up and down Finsbury Hill. And everybody used to come out of their houses and watch, because no one had ever seen a moving vehicle quite like it before. The Aveling and Porter factory employed loads of local people, like Frederick Gage. This is the agreement, the promise, that Frederick Gage signed when he joined Aveling and Porter as an apprentice. So he was very young, he was only 14 years old, and in this document he promises to join Aveling and Porter for 7 years until he's 21 and becomes a man, to serve out his apprenticeship. Aveling and Porter in turn promise that they will teach him all the skills that he needs to become an engineer. This is how a lot of people got into the workplace all that time ago. This was made in 1905. I can fit one more thing in. Just about the oldest thing we've got that comes from Strood. It's part of a building, a very important building that 800 years ago took up a large part of central Strood. As you can see, parts of it were pretty fancy. It was the Newark Hospital of St. Mary. And it was founded by a Bishop of Rochester in about 1200. Now, in those days, a hospital wasn't just a place for sick people. It was also a place for travellers, almost like a hotel, except it was run by monks, or possibly nuns, on a religious basis. These were people who had promised to serve God and their fellow men and women. And the Newark Hospital in Strood served travellers as they moved backwards and forwards along that famous road that we began with. See you soon.